Yogi, it's Bri. In this video, we're going to look at bridge, Setu Bandhasana, and Urdhva Dhanurasana, or upward bow, better known as wheel. I put together Setu Bandhasana, or bridge, and Urdhva Dhanurasana because I really like bridge as a prep for Urdhva. And both are poses that are really commonly mispracticed. And maybe it's just due to lack of awareness of the purpose of them. So let's start with bridge. Now, bridge has one of those common alignment cues that is one of my pet peeves, and it's when students or teachers will try to touch their heels with their fingers to align their feet in the right place. And personally, whenever I talk about this, I'll always ask, do we all have the same proportions? Are all of our arms the same length? Our fingers the same length? Our calves? They're not. So something like that, although it may work for one person, doesn't work for others. For me, it doesn't work because I have long arms and short legs. So whenever I do that, my heels are way too close to my butt. I would recommend just getting students to align their feet to what feels like hips distance and making sure that their shins are in as straight of a line as possible from the knees down to the tops of the feet, because we want to use our strong legs to lift our hips here. We definitely don't want the heels too close to the butt, because when that happens, go ahead and lift the hips. The legs start to externally rotate, and that's when impingement happens in the sacrum as you get deeper, and you have less power or access to the power of the muscles in the legs. So she's set up pretty nicely here. She's going to lift her hips up. Working from shoulder to shoulder, she's going to interlace her fingers underneath her body. Okay, so I set them up. Now they've lifted the hips. I'll now say, make sure that your knees, your kneecaps are in line with your frontal hip points and that the femur bones are not externally rotating. Now, we want to engage the hamstrings. And if you haven't looked at or watched my prone backbend foundation video that was about upward facing dog, Shalabhasana, and Cobra, then please do so, which talks about the importance of hamstring engagement. So, bridge, or Setu Bandhasana, is actually a prep for Urdhva Dhanurasana. And it does prep a little bit in the shoulders because you do have internal rotation and you're opening across the collarbones. But what it's really prepping, or should be prepping, is the engagement of your hamstrings. So once they've lifted the hips, once they've interlaced the fingers, I cue how they can engage their hamstrings, which is by isometrically pulling their feet back towards their shoulders. And that helps to engage the hamstring, and the hamstrings engaged means that it pulls the pelvis into a neutral position. Now from here, I also say push down firmly through the heels as you inhale, and as you exhale, draw the ribs and the navel in towards the spine. And this just helps to solidify the position of the pelvis in that neutral. Undo the interlace of your hands, lower the hips down. So now into Urdhva Dhanurasana. I'll say, remember how your knees were not externally rotating and neither were your feet. The reason why people externally rotate in bridge, or mainly in upward bow, is because of tightness in the front body. So the hip flexors, if they're tight, or even if they're not, but they're tighter than, let's say, the back body, then students will, or the minds will, take the path of least resistance. The hardest part of getting into Urdhva Dhanurasana is lifting the head up off the ground. So because we lack shoulder flexibility and sometimes arm strength, we'll open the knees, use the glutes to lift the hips, but end up in a really compromised position for the low back. So if you have a student that's pretty tight, instead of allowing them to externally rotate the feet and the femurs, I would recommend taking the feet just a little bit wider. That will give them space. Go ahead and take it wider. That will give them a little more space and solid ground to push down through the feet. Okay, now the hand position. So she's going to lift her hips up just like she did in bridge, but she's going to place her hands next to her head. One of the most common things that happens because she's internally rotating at this moment is that the hands also internally rotate. So when the hands internally rotate, the elbows splay out, and it becomes really difficult to access the supportive muscles of the shoulder girdle. And it's also really bad on the wrist. So go ahead and come up like this, and I'll show them. Good. So notice how her hands turn in. She can barely even straighten her arms, and it looks really uncomfortable. Go ahead and come down. It's probably really uncomfortable too. She did a great job of keeping her feet straight, but what I typically do or cue for students is place the hands next to your head and turn the hands out just slightly so that the fingertips face the sides of the mat. Not all the way out, but just a little bit. Does that feel okay? Yes. Now push down, come onto the crown of the head. Good. Hug the elbows in. Turn the hands out even more. Just a little bit. Yes, there you go. And push down through the hands. And notice how much more space now that she's created in the shoulders, the integration of the hands and the wrist position. From here, internally rotate the thigh bones. Drop the pelvis just slightly. Now, push your chest between the gateway of the shoulders and push down through your hands. Beautiful job. Nice. Then slowly come back down, chin to chest, and lower. Great job. Now, Urdhva Dhanurasana is one of those poses that you have limited time to cue once they're in it. And because the arms are in this position, once the arms are straight, it's also really hard to reset anything that's going on. So the prep for postures like this is so important. We'll do it one more time just to recap. Okay? She lifts her hips up, making sure her feet are hips distance or a tad bit wider. She plants her hands next to her head, and she comes to the crown of her head. Now, from the crown of her head, she turns her hands out even more the other way. Good, and hug the elbows in. Then she lifts her head up, and before her arms straighten, she begins to push her chest towards her backs of her wrists or the back of her mat. Then a little bit of internal rotation, inner thighs down, the pelvis drops just slightly, and now she really pushes through the heels of her hands to open across the shoulders. Wonderful. Then tuck the chin to the chest and lower all the way down. So it's really important when you're teaching Urdhva Dhanurasana to try to get your students to understand, just like we did in Upward Facing Dog, that it's really spinal extension that we're looking for. Because, like I said, so many students externally rotate and lift the hips up, it becomes a posterior pelvic tilt with the pubic bone being the pinnacle of